Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ellen Fidian. I work in STEM outreach at Flinders University. So today I want to talk about plastics. First, I'm going to cover a few pieces of research, some Flinders research, some non-Flinders research that looks at the impact of plastics on the environment and then some workarounds. And then I'm going to look at an activity that I've run a couple of times that can be replicated either in a lab or in a kitchen at home. I initially conceived of this webinar when it looked like we were going to be doing a lot of online learning. Now, fortunately, it seems that this isn't going to be the case, but it's still a useful task that can be done from home should anyone need to be doing it from home. It can also very easily be done in a lab. The other thing I really like about this activity is that you can apply it to a few different branches of science, and there are a few different points in the curriculum where you can use it. So I'm a chemist by training. I talk a lot about the chemistry of plastics. You can definitely talk about chemistries and polymers with this activity, but you can also apply it to environmental science. You can apply it to biology, to nutrition. There's probably a physics angle when you're looking at polymerization and thermodynamics. There's all sorts of stuff you can do with this activity. So I think it's one of those very, very useful things that's highly manipulatable. There's also going to be a lot of links for this webinar. I'll include them all in the chat. And also, if you're watching the recorded version of this, I'll put them in the description of the video. So, plastics. I'm sure we're all aware that plastics are bad for the environment. Although, interestingly, it can be kind of difficult to nail down exactly how these things can be damaging to the environment. I think it's particularly worth highlighting the impact of microplastics, so plastics that are less than 5 millimeters in length. There's some really interesting research being done at Flinders on that. One group is in the process of studying how microplastics appear in different parts of the ocean and how they appear in different parts of marine animals, so seabirds, also animals that live in the sea, marine life. There's evidence that seabirds are starving their young, for instance, based on the plastic that they are eating, particularly the microplastics, but it's very difficult to untangle the impact of plastics and climate change and other forms of pollution. So there's a few different things going on that's worth keeping an eye on. It'll be really interesting to see the results of this. We've had a couple of researchers heading out on investigator vessels. They're going to be taking samples. It'll be a few years before all of their results are written up, but I'm really interested to see how it goes. Microplastics can be created in a number of ways. Fibers from clothing is one thing that has popped up recently. So clothing that's made of polyester, any sort of plasticky clothing, even just washing it can create microplastics, which then flush into our waste and particularly into the ocean. There's also been a bit of Flinders research from the Institute for Nanoscale Science and Technology that shows that ripping open plastic bags creates these tiny plastics in the air and the environment around us. According to their study, they estimate that 10 to 30 nanograms of plastics may be generated per 300 centimeters of twisting a bag or ripping a bag. So to a certain extent, if we're using plastic, then plastic waste is unavoidable. Even if we think we're using reusable plastic, you'll still get these tiny bits of plastic that are appearing in the ocean. Effectively, the only option is to change the plastic we use rather than attempt to make the plastic we have more reusable. I think one of the things that's pointed out to me in the COVID-19 crisis is the vanishing of reusable plastic things again. So reusable coffee cups are out, for instance. People are going back to single-use things. Medical waste is also another huge problem. So much of that is plastic, and so much of that really can only be single-use at the moment for people's safety. I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that we should be operating in a zero-waste world. The students we're teaching now will have to work with drastically less waste than we currently do, because effectively the alternative is environmental collapse. I think it's better to be pragmatic about that. Transitioning entirely to reusable things is not feasible. That's what we've seen out of the COVID-19 crisis. So what we need to be thinking about instead is how we can change the things that we use so that they're better to the environment when they're disposed of. Obviously, one really important thing to focus on is recycling, and we need to get better at how we recycle things. But at the moment, it's expensive and it's also very labor intensive and very energy intensive. And it also rarely preserves the quality of the product. That's usually why it's considered the third R in reduce, reuse, recycle. The reduce and the reuse are things you should be doing more of if you possibly can. You may, however, have seen cups like these around at events and stuff, bio cups that claim to be completely biodegradable. I think this is something that has to be focused on as well, and this is something the activity I'm going to talk about in a minute focuses on as well. We should also be making things that degrade completely or can be composted. It's fairly easy to do, and it's becoming much easier to do on a scale that actually makes money, on a scale that is economically viable as well as sort of morally viable. That said, the biodegradable tag can be misleading. Sometimes things that claim to be biodegradable have to be treated first, have to have something done to it, like UV light, or they can only be composted in a certain manner. Australian standards are that 90% of the plastic has to degrade in compost within 180 days, and it's also got a couple of other requirements for things that have to happen. But not all things that call themselves biodegradable can be chucked in the compost. These cups are actually an exception, they can be composted, but lots of other things can't really, so it's worth keeping an eye on that too. Because I'm a chemist, I like to think about what things are made of, so what I'm going to talk about next is the chemistry of plastic. The very first plastic ever invented was in the 1850s. It was invented by a guy called Alexander Parkes, and what he did was he combined cotton cellulose and nitric acid. That's basically the thesis for the activity that I'm going to work with. If you combine a polysaccharide with an acid, you get something that's kind of plastic-like. It's not necessarily going to be as good a plastic as other types of plastic, but it is certainly something you can develop. Plastics are polymers. So if you're going in a chemistry direction with this workshop, you'd talk about what a polymer is. It's a molecule, it's a chain of repeating units. This makes it a very, very diverse group of molecules. So cellulose is a polymer, DNA is a polymer, and obviously plastics are polymers as well. Polymers are very, very tricky molecules to use and to digest. Humans, for instance, can't digest cellulose, even though chemically it's very, very similar to starch, which we can digest. It's just something to do with the chemistry of it. It's a very, very stable molecule. We just don't have the correct enzymes for it. Plastics, similarly, this is why they are so incredibly useful. They don't degrade because nothing can eat them. Plastic polymers, or the commonly seen plastic polymers, are made of fossil fuels. So they start with a sort of hydrocarbon. There's a difference between those two monomers, and they turned into these chains of repeating units. The different monomer, the different repeating unit inside the molecule has an effect on the type of plastic, as does the length of the chain, so the number of monomers that are linked together. This makes plastics very, very difficult to recycle and very, very difficult to degrade because nothing can eat them, nothing can digest them. That's exactly how they've been designed, and that is also their fault. It also makes them quite difficult to recycle. We talk about something being thermoplastic. That means that we can melt it and then mold it into a different shape, let it cool, and it will have the same chemical properties at the end. A lot of plastics do have that, and that means they can be recycled fairly easily. They can be recycled on the curbside in South Australia, but not all plastics. Some things don't degrade at all, and they also can't be recycled or can't be recycled with our current technology. So recycling is not going to be the only solution. We also have to think of making things that degrade. We can try to degrade our current plastics, and there has been some recent really cool research working on enzymes that do actually digest plastic. So this is from 2018, but there have been a few updates since then. There are enzymes that can actually digest plastic, current plastic. That's really, really cool, and it's a really good way of countering the plastic supply already in the ocean, but it's at the very, very start. It's going to be years before this becomes an actual viable solution, and this enzyme also only works for one type of plastic. We need enzymes that work for loads of other types of plastic as well. So we want to look at the top of the supply chain as well as the bottom of the supply chain. So this brings me to the polymer that I really want to talk about, starch. So starch is a polymer. It's actually two polymers. Both of them are made from glucose. So the monomer in starch is a glucose molecule, a sugar molecule. You get one type of starch, amylose. It's about 20 to 30% of the starch. It's these very, very long, neat, singular glucose chains. And then amylopectin, it's much shorter. They're more branched chains and they're way less organized. So you tend to have all of these branches coming off. That's the majority of the starch. You can get waxy sort of starches that have almost no amylose, so that makes them a lot less solid. They're more kind of, they're like oils, although they're not oils. We've also created starches that are pure amylose, so no amylopectin. We've created them using genetically modified organisms. So they've produced pure amylose, and it's kind of this yellowish, slightly oily substance. Now, if you boil a starch, any starch, wheat starch, potato starch, presumably rice starch, all of those things, if you boil any of them in acid, what happens is these chains in the amylopectin get cut. They get cut by the acid, and the result is that you get a lot of much shorter starch chains. That creates a much more plasticky sort of substance. You've probably actually already seen this, although you might not know it. So gummy lollies are usually made of this thing that includes a thickener, which is an acid-modified wheat starch. So that's exactly what I was talking about. You boil a starch in acid for a bit, and it creates this slightly thicker substance. If you keep boiling it, or if you add different things to it, or if you allow it to dry properly, you're going to end up with a very plasticky substance. So that brings me to this recipe. Exactly like I said, if you boil starch in acid for a bit, it's going to turn into a type of plastic. Here are my suggestions for creating a plastic in your classroom. So if you use either potato or wheat flour, you can get potato flour at a variety of different stores. I recommend you start with potato because it's a little bit easier, and add it to about 5 ml of vinegar and then some water, preferably distilled or deionized water like ironing water, and then boil it. And then simmer it for 15 minutes and allow it to dry. You'll create this kind of plasticky substance. Sometimes it can take up to a week to dry. You'll get this kind of slimy thing and you'll think I've just made slime again. But leave it for a while and it will turn into this sort of plasticky substance. Then the things you add to your recipe will change the way you will change the type of plastic that you make. So I'm going to put this recipe in the description as well, so you don't have to write it down yourself if you don't particularly want to. Now, the type of starch you use, the type of acid you use, how much water you have, and any other things you add are going to change the way the starch works. So potato starch, it's got less amylopectin, it's got more amylose. So the result is that you get this slightly clearer plastic when you're working with it because the acid is going to break up fewer of those amylopectin chains. Wheat starch, on the other hand, tends to be more opaque because it's got more amylopectin in it. It also tends to be a little bit more brittle when you make it. The acid you use has an effect as well. So if you use a lot of vinegar, you can use, I've done it with 25 ml vinegar, that's going to dissolve a lot of the amylopectin. So you're going to leave much smaller, neater chains. So it's going to plasticize more. It's probably also going to be a fair bit more brittle. If you use less vinegar, you'll have a slightly more flexible plastic. The distilled water, you can basically play with the vinegar. It doesn't have to be vinegar. It has to be acidic. So you can use, I've seen people use hydrochloric acid, other acids as well. The trick, it's probably worth pointing out to your students, indeed, is that the pH of the acid is going to change, and that's going to affect the type of plastic that you make. And it's not a simple case of, well, it's worth remembering that pH is logarithmic. So a pH of 1 is 10 times stronger than a pH of 2. So you can't substitute half as much hydrochloric acid for vinegar. You need to think a little bit more clearly about how that's going to go. Glycerol is the other thing I really want to point out. So if you add glycerol to the plastic, you can look at the way the chemistry works. There are a few really good explanations online on what the glycerol does to the plastic, but basically it makes the plastic flexible. So it cuts these really long amylose chains into shorter chains. And it also makes the plastic more water resistant. So it's useful if you're creating something that's going to be holding a liquid. If you don't use glycerol in this case, you're probably going to get something that dissolves relatively quickly on a liquid. Or if you leave it for too long, it grows fur. That's worth keeping an eye on as well. And food coloring is the other thing that's worth adding to this plastic. It can change the color and the appearance of the non-hazardous dye. So like I said, there are a variety of ways you can apply this activity. I've done it for a few different things. But what I would really suggest you do is that you get students to design their own recipes. So you can either get them to test the effects of these different plastics together, or you can get them to design their own and or you can give them this information and then get them to choose which plastics they want to do. That's, I think, probably the best way to do it because it's a very, very simple recipe, like you've seen. You don't really need to do much to it, but it gives you a lot of scope for being a bit creative, doing different things. Now, one last thing that I think is worth pointing out, for both potato and wheat plastic, there are commercial plastics that are made out of these starches. Not many of them though, and they're not particularly popular. And the main reason for that is that potato and wheat are both foods. So we don't particularly want to be using starches that we would otherwise be using to grow food to create a plastic. Bamboo plastic works on a similar theory. Cotton plastic works on a similar theory. They both have polysaccharides in them that are very, very similar to starch, and they have become commercially viable. So I think that's the other thing that's worth pointing out to the students when you're developing this. All right, that's just about everything I've got to say. So if you have any questions, please do drop them in the chat. And indeed, we have a question. What would be the use life be like for a starch plastic? Would it be reusable or be more like a replacement for a single-use plastic? Would you have to be careful with what you used it for in case of reactions with other substances? So the use life, the recipe I've given you is basically single use only, although it depends on where you're going to be using it. So if you're creating like a little mold, for instance, I've seen students try to make a pair of sunglasses out of it. That's something that could last for a really long time. The issue is if it gets wet. If it's got a lot of glycerol in it, that's probably okay. If it doesn't, you've basically got flour and water. So that's going to end up growing fur, which I've seen happen. It's not ideal. So as a general rule, probably you'd be thinking of it as a replacement for a single-use plastic. Next question. Are there waste products from these plants, like the stalks of the wheat that aren't eaten, that could be used without compromising the amount of food that is produced for eating? That's a really good question. I think that's probably the case, yes, although collecting waste products can be really difficult. I'm not a farmer, I don't know very much about agriculture, but I think you'd need to talk to people about how that worked. I would suspect, though, that probably the starches wouldn't be useful. That said, we do talk about farms that don't send a lot of their food to market because it looks weird or strange. That might be a useful application for that, although I personally think eating it is probably a better application for it. If you have any other questions, please do drop them in the chat. And if while we're waiting on any other questions, I just want to highlight some upcoming webinars we have. So tomorrow we're doing a panel with some engineering students. I'm really, really looking forward to it. If you've got any students at all who are interested in engineering, I would thoroughly encourage them to check out that panel. You can ask our engineering students anything. They're going to have a lot of really cool things to say. The other thing I really want to highlight is if you know any maths teachers who want to do some teacher PD, want to get their hours up, next Wednesday and the Wednesday after, we're running 2 webinars on beautiful mathematical objects. So the first one looks at prime numbers and the second one looks at a different thing. So they're both kind of maths focused. They're both going to be run by the same person, but they're both going to cover different things, and I'm really looking forward to them. I think they're going to be really exciting. Another question. Would you run this experiment as one lesson with students? How long does it take them to actually make the plastic? So to actually make it, it's not very long, it's like half an hour. The trick is getting the plastic to dry. So it can take over a week for the plastic to dry properly and get all of its properties. So it's something you'd want to revisit multiple times, I think, rather than something you want to run in one cohesive lesson. So perhaps one week you design the plastic, the next week you make it, the next week you come back and look and see what's happened, and then you can review it. So it's a sort of long-term project. If you're watching the recorded version of this, or if a thought occurs to you later on and you really want to get in touch with me, that's my phone number on the screen. You can also email me. If you want to talk to STEM outreach more generally, stem@flinders.edu.au is the best way to get in touch with us. And we're happy to take any questions you have, any requests you have for support with your classroom. We will do our best to support you with that. All right, that's about it from me. If you have any other questions, please do drop them in the chat right now. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. I hope that was interesting, and I wish you all the best of luck with your teaching.